Divorced for 6 years, CEO sees ex-wife in hospital and is shocked to learn she secretly raised his son all alone. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. And if you're joining us for the very first time, welcome home. You've just found a place where every story is written with soul and every heart is treated like family. That includes you. Before we begin, please allow me to cover you in this prayer, soft, healing, and sent with all my love. May peace calm your heart like a lullaby. May every heavy thought be replaced with quiet comfort. May something gentle visit your spirit today. A kind word, a memory, a reason to smile. I pray your wounds begin to heal in silence, and that love reminds you just how needed you are in this world. You are seen, you are chosen, you are endlessly loved. Now, my dear family, for the past 2 days, I've been fighting a strong migraine, the kind that presses on your body and spirit. If you've ever had one, please tell me. How did you get through it? Your advice, your prayers. I truly need them right now. And I'll be honest, today I felt a little hurt. I looked and there were so few likes, so few comments. It made me wonder, have you grown tired of me? I'm sorry. Maybe I got emotional, but it's only because I love you so deeply. This bond we have, it's not just YouTube to me, it's heart to heart. And sometimes I fear that one day I might not be here, that no one will tell you, Mr. Peter is no more. That's why I speak now. That's why I give my all. So please, don't leave this story in the middle. Every word was written with love for you. And when the story ends, I ask softly, rate it out of 10 in the comments. If you don't, I'll quietly mind. Not in anger, but because you matter to me. Like the video. Leave a kind word. Share it with someone who needs love. Let this family shine, strong, faithful, and full of heart. Let's begin. With all my love, always.
The silence in the boardroom was worth $50 million. Brett Anthony watched tension ripple across the mahogany table as 12 of Silicon Valley's most powerful executives sat frozen, waiting for his decision. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Industries' 42nd floor, San Francisco glittered in the afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. But Brett's steel-gray eyes remained fixed on the contract before him. "Gentlemen," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built his empire, "you're asking me to sell my company's soul for a number that looks impressive on paper, but represents everything I've spent 6 years refusing to become." Charles Hendricks, CEO of Titan Corp., shifted uncomfortably in his Italian leather chair. "Brett, this merger would make you the youngest billionaire in tech. Your shareholders—" "My shareholders," Brett interrupted, standing and walking to the window, his 6-foot frame casting a long shadow across the polished table, "trusted me to build something that matters. Not just another corporate acquisition to be gutted and forgotten." He turned back to face them, and for a moment the mask of the ruthless CEO slipped, revealing something raw and haunted beneath. "I've already sacrificed too much for success that means nothing." The words hung in the air like an accusation against himself. Brett had learned to speak in boardrooms the way others spoke in churches, with reverence for the almighty dollar and absolute conviction in his own vision. But today, something felt different. Today, the victory tasted like ashes in his mouth. "The answer is no," he said simply. "Meridian Industries remains independent." The room erupted in protests, but Brett was already moving toward the door, his mind suddenly, inexplicably, drifting to a memory he'd spent 6 years trying to bury. Elka laughing as she spun around their tiny apartment kitchen, flour in her dark hair, trying to teach him how to make bread from scratch. "You can't rush everything, Brett," she'd said, her warm brown eyes dancing with affection. "Some things need time to grow." "Mr. Anthony," Hendricks called after him, desperation creeping into his polished tone, You're making a mistake that will cost you everything. Brett paused at the door, his hand on the brushed steel handle. I've already lost everything that mattered, he said quietly. Money can't buy it back. The elevator ride to his office felt like descending into his own private hell. Brett loosened his silk tie, a habit Elke used to tease him about. You always look like you're choking on your own success, she'd said once, reaching up to adjust his collar with gentle fingers. He could still feel the phantom touch of her hands against his neck, still smell the jasmine perfume she wore on special occasions. Brett collapsed into his chair and pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk, the one drawer his assistant never organized. Inside, beneath old business cards and forgotten USB drives, lay a single photograph. He pulled it out with trembling fingers. Elke smiled back at him from their wedding day, radiant in a simple white dress they'd bought off the rack because they'd spent their savings on the down payment for their first apartment. Her hand rested on his chest, right over his heart, and he was looking at her like she was the answer to every question he'd never known how to ask. They'd been 26 and 24, respectively, drunk on love and certainty that they could conquer the world together. We're going to change everything, he'd whispered in her ear that night as they danced to music from her phone in their empty living room, surrounded by moving boxes and dreams. You and me against the world. As long as we don't change each other, she'd whispered back, her voice soft with trust. But they had changed. Or rather, he had changed, morphing from the passionate young entrepreneur who stayed up all night, talking about making technology that would help people, into a man who measured success in stock prices and market dominance. He'd convinced himself that every 18-hour workday, every missed dinner, every just one more deal was building their future together. He'd been building her a castle while letting their foundation crumble. The final fight played in his memory like a movie he'd seen too many times. Elke, standing in the doorway of their bedroom at 2 a.m, her face streaked with tears and exhaustion. I can't do this anymore, Brett. I feel like I'm married to a ghost. I'm doing this for us, he'd snapped, not even looking up from his laptop. Do you think this level of success just happens? Do you think I can just turn it off? I think you've forgotten why you turned it on in the first place. Her voice had been barely above a whisper, but it cut through him like a blade. When we got married, you said you wanted to build something beautiful, but all you've built is walls. That's not fair. When was the last time you asked me about my day? When was the last time we talked about anything that didn't involve your company? When was the last time you looked at me, really looked at me, and saw the woman you fell in love with instead of just another responsibility to manage? He'd finally looked up then, and the pain in her eyes had nearly brought him to his knees. But his pride, his damnable pride, had kept him seated. If you can't handle being married to someone with ambition, don't. She'd held up her hand and he'd seen her wedding ring catch the light from his laptop screen. Don't you dare make this about ambition. This is about you choosing to be alone. Every single day you choose to be alone. She'd left for her sister's house that night. He'd filed for divorce 2 weeks later, telling himself it was better to end things cleanly than to drag out the inevitable. He'd convinced himself that he was setting her free to find someone who could give her the attention he was too driven to provide. Now, 6 years later, holding her photograph in his empty office, Brett finally understood the truth. He hadn't been protecting her from his ambition. He'd been protecting his ambition from her love, because somewhere deep down he'd known that if he'd allowed himself to truly love her the way she deserved, he might have become a different man entirely. The intercom buzzed, jolting him back to the present. Mr. Anthony, his assistant's voice was professionally neutral. Your partner Joaquin is here for the celebration dinner. Should I tell him you're ready? Brett carefully placed the photograph back in the drawer and straightened his tie. Outside, the city twinkled with the promise of another successful evening, another step up the ladder he'd been climbing alone for 6 years. Tell him I'll be right there, Brett said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. As he stood and grabbed his suit jacket, Brett caught his reflection in the darkened window. He looked successful, powerful, untouchable. He looked exactly like the man he'd set out to become when he'd signed those divorce papers. He looked like a stranger. Tonight he would celebrate another victory in a war he was no longer sure he wanted to win. But first, just for a moment, he allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be the man who'd once promised a beautiful woman that they would change the world together. The man who'd kept only half that promise. Chapter 2. Code Blue. The champagne tasted like regret, but Joaquin Rivera was too drunk on success to notice. "To Meridian Industries," he bellowed, raising his crystal flute high above the rooftop restaurant where San Francisco's tech elite had gathered to celebrate their latest product launch. "And to my brilliant partner, Brett Anthony, who just told Titan Corp they could take their $50 million and invest it elsewhere." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, but Brett barely heard them. He stood at the edge of the terrace, watching the city lights blur through his untouched champagne, his mind still trapped in that photograph from his desk drawer. The celebration felt hollow, like applauding an empty theater. "You look like a man who just won the lottery but lost his wallet," Joaquin said, appearing at Brett's elbow with slightly glassy eyes and a grin that belonged on a man half his 42 years. "What's eating you, hermano?" "We just launched the most innovative educational software platform in history, and you're standing here looking like someone died." Brett almost smiled at that. Someone had died. The man he used to be, the man who would have shared this moment with the woman he loved, who would have called her from the stage to tell her they'd just changed the world. That man had died 6 years ago in a lawyer's office, suffocated by pride and ambition. "Just thinking," Brett said, finally taking a sip of champagne that tasted like expensive bubbles and empty victories. "Dangerous habit," Joaquin chuckled, then suddenly clutched his chest, his face going white as the tablecloth. "Brett, The crystal flute shattered against the concrete as Joaquin collapsed, his body convulsing as cardiac arrest seized him like a vicious predator. Brett dropped to his knees beside his friend, his business training instantly replaced by the first aid certification he'd earned in college and never expected to use. "Call 911, he shouted to the crowd of frozen executives. "Now!" The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of sirens, EMTs, and the controlled chaos of emergency medicine. Brett rode in the ambulance, holding Joaquin's hand while paramedics worked over his friend's still form, and found himself praying to a God he'd stopped believing in around the same time he'd stopped believing in love. General Memorial Hospital at night was a different world. Harsh fluorescent lights casting everything in shades of urgency, the constant symphony of beeping machines and hurried footsteps echoing off sterile walls. Brett paced the cardiac ICU waiting room like a caged animal, his expensive suit wrinkled, his normally perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Dr. Patel emerged from the treatment room at 11:47 p.m., her surgical mask hanging around her neck like a flag of surrender. "Your friend is stable," she said without preamble. "We've managed to restore normal rhythm, but the next 24 hours are critical. He's lucky you knew CPR." Brett nodded, relief flooding through him like warm water. "Can I see him?" "Family only for now. Are you—" "He doesn't have family," Brett said quietly. "I'm all he's got." Dr. Patel studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the ICU doors. "Room 314, but only for a few minutes." Brett walked through the automatic doors into the heart of the hospital, past rooms where other people's loved ones fought their own battles against mortality. The antiseptic smell triggered memories he'd buried. His father's final days in a place just like this, when Brett had been too young to understand death and too stubborn to cry. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed her. But then, like a ghost materializing from his deepest regrets, she was there. Elka Harms stood at the nurse's station 30 feet away, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her scrubs the soft blue of a summer sky. She was exactly as beautiful as she'd been in his memories, but different too. There was a strength in her posture that hadn't been there before, a confidence that came from surviving storms and learning to dance in the rain. Time stopped. The hospital sounds faded to white noise. The world narrowed to just this moment, this impossible coincidence that felt like destiny laughing at his carefully constructed life. She turned, and their eyes met across the hallway. For a heartbeat, her professional composure cracked, and he saw recognition flash across her features like lightning. Her lips parted slightly, and he caught her sharp intake of breath, even from this distance. 6 years collapsed into nothing, and they were 26 and 24 again, standing in their empty apartment, promising each other forever. Then the moment shattered. Elka's expression shuttered, her warm brown eyes turning cold and professional. She turned back to the chart in her hands, dismissing him as effectively as if he'd never existed. But Brett had seen that flash of vulnerability, that instant of pain, and it hit him harder than any boardroom rejection ever could. He stood frozen in the hallway, watching her move with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to save lives while he'd been learning to close deals. A young resident approached her with a question, and Brett caught the sound of her voice, still warm honey and late-night conversations, but with an authority that spoke of years spent making decisions that mattered. "Excuse me," said a voice behind him. "Are you Brett Anthony?" Brett turned to find a tall man in scrubs, his badge identifying him as Nurse Thompson. "Yes, your friend is asking for you. Room 314. Brett nodded, but his eyes were drawn back to Elka. She was walking away now, her steps purposeful, her shoulders straight. He memorized the way she moved, the way she paused to check on a patient through a doorway, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar it made his chest ache. Room 314 was a cave of machines and monitors, but Joaquin's eyes were open, focusing on Brett with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes after brushing against death. "Did I die?" Joaquin whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed. "No," Brett said, pulling a chair close to the bed, "but you scared the hell out of me." "Good," Joaquin managed a weak smile. "Maybe now you'll stop working 18-hour days and actually live a little." Brett was quiet for a moment, thinking about the woman in the hallway, about the roads not taken and the words never spoken. "Maybe you're right. I'm always right. That's why we're partners." Joaquin's eyes drifted closed, then opened again. "Hey, Brett." "Yeah? That nurse who checked on me earlier, the pretty one with the kind eyes. She asked if I had family coming. When I told her about you, she got this look on her face." Joaquin paused, studying Brett's expression. "You know her, don't you?" Brett's throat felt tight. I used to love her?" The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with the weight of confession. Brett had never told Joaquin about Elka, had never told anyone about the woman who'd owned his heart before he'd traded it for stock options and market share. "Yeah," he whispered. "I used to love her." "What happened?" Brett was quiet for so long that Joaquin's eyes started to drift closed again. Then, barely audible above the rhythm of the heart monitor, Brett spoke the truth he'd never admitted to himself. "I chose wrong." When Joaquin's breathing deepened into sleep, Brett sat alone in the mechanical twilight of the ICU, listening to the machines that were keeping his friend alive and thinking about the woman who'd once kept his soul alive. Outside the window, the city continued its restless dance of ambition and desire, but inside this small room, surrounded by the evidence of how quickly everything could change, Brett Anthony finally began to understand the difference between success and significance. Somewhere in this hospital, Elka was saving lives, making a difference that mattered, becoming the person she'd always been meant to be. And here he sat, master of an empire built on code and algorithms, wondering when he'd stopped measuring success by the love in his life and started measuring it by the zeros in his bank account. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, marking the beginning of a new day. Brett closed his eyes and, for the first time in 6 years, allowed himself to remember not just what he'd lost, but what he might still be able to find, if he was brave enough to look for it. Chapter 3. Ghosts in the Pediatric Ward. Sleep was a luxury Brett couldn't afford when his past lived just 3 floors below. He'd spent the night in Joaquin's room, watching monitors and wrestling with memories. But as dawn painted the hospital windows gold, Brett found himself inexplicably drawn toward the elevator. He told himself he was going to the cafeteria for coffee. He told himself he needed to stretch his legs. He told himself anything except the truth. That seeing Elka again had awakened something in him that 6 years of success hadn't been able to touch. The pediatric ward occupied the entire 7th floor, and the moment the elevator doors opened, Brett stepped into a different universe. Gone were the sterile whites and institutional grays of the cardiac unit. Here the walls burst with color, hand-painted murals of sailing ships and flying dragons, photo collages of smiling children, and artwork that could only have been created by small hands and boundless imagination. The sounds were different too. Instead of the mechanical beeping of life support machines, Brett heard laughter floating from a common room, the gentle murmur of bedtime stories being read, and something that made his heart stop entirely. Elka's voice, warm and musical, drifting from somewhere deeper in the ward. He followed the sound like a man following a siren's call, past rooms where brave little warriors fought battles that would have broken grown men. A bald girl of maybe 8 waved at him from her doorway, a smile too bright for someone who'd clearly seen too much. A boy with leg braces was teaching a nurse how to play chess, his moves calculated with the precision of a chess master. But it was the scene in the sunroom that brought Brett to a complete standstill. Elka sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, surrounded by 6 children of various ages, a picture book open in her lap. She was in her element here, animated and glowing, using different voices for each character in what appeared to be a story about a dragon who was afraid of his own fire. But Princess Maya wasn't scared, Elka continued, making her voice small and brave for the princess character. She looked right at that terrified dragon and said, "Sometimes the thing that makes you different is the thing that makes you special." A little boy with oxygen tubes in his nose leaned forward eagerly. "Did the dragon learn to be brave, Miss Elka?" "Well," Elka said conspiratorially, "the dragon learned that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared." Brett pressed himself against the doorframe, hidden in the shadows, watching this woman he'd once known better than his own heartbeat transform into someone magnificent. This was what she'd always been meant to do, not just heal bodies, but heal spirits. She'd talked about working with children during their marriage, had lit up whenever she'd mentioned her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse, but he'd been too focused on his own ambitions to really listen. "Miss Elka," asked a girl with a bright pink headscarf covering her bald head, "do you think people can change? Like, really change?" Elka was quiet for a moment, her fingers absently smoothing the pages of the book. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she wasn't just answering the child's question. "I think people change all the time, sweetheart. Every day we get to choose who we want to be. Sometimes we make mistakes, sometimes we hurt people we love, but every morning is a chance to be better than we were yesterday." "But what if someone really, really messed up?" the girl persisted. "What if they broke something important?" Elka's eyes grew distant, and Brett wondered if she could sense him watching her, if some part of her remembered how they used to be able to feel each other's presence across a crowded room. "Then they have to prove they've changed," she said finally. "Not with words, but with actions. Not just once, but every day for as long as it takes. And even then—" She paused, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Even then, sometimes broken things can't be fixed. Sometimes the best you can do is learn from the pieces." Brett felt those words hit him like physical blows. He started to step forward, some desperate part of him wanting to interrupt, to explain, to somehow bridge the chasm his choices had created. But then he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see a small boy approaching. The child couldn't have been older than 5, with caramel skin that perfectly blended Elka's warmth with something that made Brett's breath catch in his throat. The boy's hair curled in soft waves that Brett recognized from his own childhood photos, and when he looked up at Brett with serious dark eyes, it was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just features, but something deeper, an intensity, a way of observing the world that Brett had seen in his own reflection for 34 years. "Are you here to see someone?" the boy asked with the solemn politeness of a child who'd spent too much time around adults and medical situations. Brett crouched down to the boy's eye level, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm visiting a friend upstairs. What about you? Are you visiting someone too?" "My mama works here," the boy said proudly. "She takes care of sick kids and makes them feel better. She's the best nurse in the whole world." From the sunroom, Brett heard Elka's laughter as one of the children made a joke about the dragon in the story. The sound pulled at something deep in his chest, a longing so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. "What's your name?" Brett asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything. "Willard," the boy said. "Willard Harms. What's yours?" The last name hit Brett like a punch to the solar plexus. She'd kept her maiden name, hadn't tried to erase their marriage completely, but she'd given their child, and Brett was suddenly, absolutely certain this was their child. Only her name, claiming him entirely as her own. "I'm Brett," he managed, his voice rough. "That's a nice name," Willard said matter-of-factly. "Do you want to meet my mama? She's reading stories to my friends." Before Brett could answer, Willard had taken his hand with the trusting innocence of childhood, leading him toward the sunroom where Elka's voice continued weaving magic for her young audience. Brett's mind raced, calculating dates, remembering their last night together before everything fell apart. 9 months before this boy's birth would put his conception right around. "Mama," Willard called out as they entered the sunroom, "I found someone new." Elka looked up, and the moment her eyes met Brett's, the color drained from her face. The book slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers, and Brett watched 6 years of carefully constructed composure crumble in an instant. "Children," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the shock in her eyes. "Why don't you go find Nurse Williams? I think she has some new coloring books in her office." The kids scattered with the enthusiasm of youth, leaving Brett and Elka alone in the sunroom with Willard standing between them, a living bridge connecting their past to an impossible present. "Hello, Elka," Brett said quietly. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was steady, professional, but Brett could see the rapid pulse at her throat, could read the tension in her shoulders. "My business partner had a heart attack last night. I was visiting him upstairs and decided to wander around the children's ward." Her eyes flicked to Willard, then back to Brett, and he saw the fierce protectiveness of a mother recognizing a threat to her cub. "I heard your voice," Brett said simply. "I followed it." They stared at each other across 5 feet of colored carpet and 6 years of silence, while Willard looked between them with the confused curiosity of a child sensing undercurrents he couldn't understand. "Mama, do you know him?" Willard asked. Elka's mouth opened, then closed. Brett watched her struggle with how to answer, and in that struggle he saw the truth of everything. The late nights she'd worked to support them both. The strength she'd found to raise their son alone. The grace she'd shown in never demanding anything from the man who'd abandoned them both without even knowing it. "We knew each other a long time ago," she said finally, her eyes never leaving Brett's face. "Before you were born." Willard seemed to accept this explanation with the easy adaptability of childhood. "Are you going to visit us again?" he asked Brett directly. The question hung in the air like a prayer, like a test, like a door that could open onto either redemption or deeper pain. Brett looked at this perfect little boy who carried his eyes and his stubborn cowlick and his mother's beautiful heart, and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 6 years. "I don't know," he answered honestly, because children deserved truth even when adults couldn't handle it. Willard nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Well, if you do come back, maybe you can read stories too. Mama says different people tell stories in different ways, and that makes them more interesting." From somewhere down the hall, a voice called for Nurse Harms, and Elka straightened, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I have to go," she said. "Willard, stay in the common room until I get back." She moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back at Brett with eyes that held 6 years of questions and accusations and something that might have been hope, if hope could survive so much damage. "Goodbye, Brett," she said, and he heard all the weight of finality in those 2 simple words. But as she walked away, Brett remained standing in that sunroom, full of children's artwork and afternoon sunshine, with his son beside him asking if he knew any good stories about dragons. And for the first time in 6 years, Brett Anthony believed that maybe, just maybe, the most important story of his life was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Child with Familiar Eyes. The hospital cafeteria at 3 in the afternoon existed in a strange limbo between lunch and dinner, populated by exhausted residents, worried families, and lost souls like Brett, who couldn't seem to find their way back to the world outside these walls. He'd been coming here for 3 days now, telling himself he was checking on Joaquin's recovery. But really, he was hunting for glimpses of a woman who'd made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. Each day he'd caught sight of Elka in hallways, always moving with purpose, always looking through him as if he were made of glass. Each day the weight of recognition had grown heavier in his chest. Today was different. Today he wasn't alone at his corner table with his untouched sandwich and cold coffee. "Are you going to eat that?" Brett looked up to find Willard standing beside his table, small hands pressed against the edge, dark eyes fixed on the turkey sandwich that had been sitting untouched for 20 minutes. The boy wore jeans with grass stains on the knees and a t-shirt featuring a cartoon dinosaur that had seen better days. "I'm not very hungry," Brett said, pushing the plate toward the boy. "Would you like it?" Willard climbed into the opposite chair with the unself-conscious confidence of childhood and began methodically deconstructing the sandwich, eating the turkey first, then the cheese, leaving the bread for last. Brett watched, fascinated by the boy's systematic approach to his meal. "Mama says I eat weird," Willard said around a bite of cheese, apparently reading Brett's expression. "But I like to taste each thing by itself first, then all together. It's like listening to all the instruments in a song separate before you hear the whole music." The observation was so unexpectedly sophisticated that Brett felt his chest tighten. That's actually very smart. Most people never think about how things work together. Willard beamed at the praise, then pulled a small notebook from his pocket and opened it on the table. The pages were filled with intricate drawings, not the typical scribbles of a 5-year-old, but detailed sketches of buildings, machines, and geometric patterns that showed an understanding of perspective and design that should have been years beyond his age. "What are you working on?" Brett asked. I'm designing a hospital for dinosaurs, Willard said seriously, turning the notebook so Brett could see. See, regular hospitals are built for people, but dinosaurs would need different things, like really big doors for the long-neck ones, and special rooms for the flying ones, and swimming pools for the water dinosaurs. Brett leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. The drawings were remarkably sophisticated, showing not just the exterior of buildings, but cross-sections revealing interior layouts, elevators that could accommodate massive creatures, and even what appeared to be specialized medical equipment. This is incredible, Brett said, and meant it. How did you learn to draw like this? Willard shrugged, continuing to work on his sketch. I just see how things should be in my head, and then I draw them. Mama says I have an imagination that works in 3 dimensions, whatever that means. Brett's throat felt tight. He'd been exactly the same as a child, constantly building things with blocks, drawing elaborate blueprints for tree houses that defied the laws of physics, seeing the world not as it was, but as it could be. His mother had called it his architect's brain. His father had worried it meant he spent too much time alone. Where's your mama now? Brett asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Working. She has to help a little girl who's scared of getting shots, so she sent me down here to get a snack. Willard looked up from his drawing. She doesn't know I'm talking to you. She said you were someone from before, and that sometimes people from before should stay there. The words hit Brett like a physical blow, but he tried not to let it show. What do you think about that? Willard considered this with the gravity of a much older person. I think grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be. Like, if someone was nice to you before, why can't they be nice to you now? People don't stop being nice just because time happens. Time can change people, Brett said carefully. Sometimes people make mistakes that hurt other people, and then things get complicated. Did you make a mistake that hurt my mama? The question was asked with such innocent directness that Brett felt the air leave his lungs. Willard continued drawing, apparently unaware that he'd just detonated a bomb in Brett's carefully controlled world. Yes, Brett said quietly. I made a very big mistake. Did you say sorry? I. Brett paused, realizing he'd never actually apologized, never tried to explain, never done anything but sign papers and walk away. Number I didn't say sorry. Willard nodded as if this explained everything. Mama says sorry is the most important word in the world, but only if you mean it. And you have to say it with actions too, not just with words. Brett watched this extraordinary child, his son, his flesh and blood, dispense wisdom that put Brett's Harvard MBA to shame, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. Willard, he said carefully, when is your birthday? December 15th, Willard said without looking up from his drawing. I'll be 6 this year. Mama says that's old enough to start taking piano lessons if I want to. December 15th. Brett's hands began to shake as he did the math. 9 months before December 15th was March, specifically the week in March 6 years ago when he and Elka had their last night together. The night before he'd left for Tokyo, before everything fell apart, before he'd chosen his company over his marriage. The night they'd made love with desperate passion, as if they both sensed it might be the last time. Are you okay? Willard asked, looking up with concern. You look kind of sick. Brett struggled to breathe normally. I'm fine, just thinking about something. My mama thinks a lot too, Willard said. Sometimes I catch her looking at me like she's trying to solve a puzzle, and sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep, she cries very quietly. The image of Elka crying alone, raising their son while Brett built his empire in ignorant bliss, was almost more than he could bear. How many nights had she struggled? How many times had she needed help, needed support, needed someone to share the weight of loving this perfect little boy. "Willard," Brett said, his voice rough with emotion, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" "An inventor," Willard said immediately. "I want to build things that help people, like, what if there were machines that could make sick people better just by hugging them? Or what if there were buildings that could move around so people never had to be homeless?" Brett closed his eyes, seeing himself at 5 years old, sitting in his father's study, drawing similar impossible inventions and declaring his intention to fix everything that's broken in the world. How had he gone from that idealistic child to a man who measured success only in profit margins? "Those are beautiful dreams," Brett said. "Mama says dreams are just plans that haven't happened yet," Willard replied, then looked up at Brett with those familiar dark eyes. "Do you have any dreams?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Brett wasn't sure he was ready to face. Did he have dreams? Or had he traded them all for market dominance and boardroom victories? Looking at this brilliant, beautiful boy, looking at his son, Brett realized he did have dreams. New dreams, dreams of bedtime stories and science museum visits, of teaching someone how to throw a baseball and helping with math homework, of being the kind of father who would never choose anything over his child's laughter. "I'm starting to," Brett said honestly. Willard smiled, an expression so bright and genuine that Brett felt his heart crack open a little wider. "That's good. Mama says it's never too late to start dreaming new dreams." "Your mama is a very wise woman." "The wisest," Willard agreed loyally. Then he closed his notebook and slid off his chair. "I should go back upstairs. Mama will worry if I'm gone too long. She worries about everything since it's just us two." Just us two. The words echoed in Brett's mind as he watched his son walk away, small shoulders straight with the independence of a child who'd learned too young that he and his mother were a team of two against the world. Brett sat alone in the cafeteria, staring at the empty chair where his son had sat, processing the magnitude of what he'd lost through his own selfishness and what he might still be able to find if he was brave enough to try. For the first time in 6 years, Brett Anthony had a dream that had nothing to do with stock prices or market share. He dreamed of becoming the man his son already thought he could be, someone who said sorry with actions, someone who built things that helped people, someone who understood that the most important success in life couldn't be measured in dollars but in the love and trust of the people who mattered most. He dreamed of earning his way back into a family he'd never known he'd lost. The question was, would they let him try? Chapter 5. Unraveling Truths. The business card felt like a loaded weapon in Brett's hand. Aaron Sullivan, private investigator, discreet, professional, results guaranteed. He'd been staring at it for 20 minutes, sitting in his Tesla in the hospital parking garage, engine off, wrestling with the kind of moral dilemma they didn't teach you how to solve in business school. The investigator had come highly recommended by his attorney, a man who specialized in finding information that people preferred to keep hidden. All it would take was one phone call, and within 48 hours, Brett would have Willard's birth certificate, medical records, genetic confirmation of what his heart already knew. But using a private investigator felt like a violation of everything Elka had built in their years apart, a crude intrusion into the life she'd created without him. She'd made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him, and here he was, contemplating the professional equivalent of breaking into her privacy. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Board meeting moved to 4 p.m. Henderson Industries wants to discuss the partnership proposal. Brett stared at the message, realizing that for the first time in his professional life, a board meeting felt irrelevant. Henderson Industries could offer him all the partnerships in the world, and it wouldn't change the fact that upstairs in this hospital, his son was probably helping his mother comfort frightened children, while Brett sat in a parking garage contemplating hiring strangers to spy on them. He tore the business card in half. Instead of making the call that would have given him answers, Brett found himself walking back into the hospital and taking the elevator to the 7th floor. He'd spent the last 3 days learning the pediatric ward's rhythms, shift changes, meal times, visiting hours. He knew that Elka worked 3 12-hour shifts a week, that she preferred the day shift when she could help it, and that she often stayed late when one of her young patients needed extra comfort. The volunteer coordinator's office was tucked between the gift shop and the Family Resource Center, a cluttered space that smelled like coffee and determination. Janet Morrison, a 60-something woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, looked up from her computer with the kind of smile that could comfort grieving families or intimidate hospital administrators, depending on the situation. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to volunteer," Brett said, the words coming out steadier than he felt. "In the pediatric ward." Janet's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's wonderful. We can always use more help, especially men willing to work with the children. May I ask what brings you to us?" Brett had rehearsed several answers to this question, but standing in Janet's office, all his practiced explanations crumbled into something simpler and more honest. "I want to help," he said. "I want to do something meaningful." Janet studied him for a long moment, taking in his expensive suit, his obvious discomfort with the institutional furniture, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the hallway leading to the pediatric ward. "Volunteering with sick children isn't like writing a check to charity, Mr. Anthony. Brett Anthony. Mr. Anthony, these kids don't need your pity or your guilt. They need your presence, your patience, and your genuine care. They can smell insincerity from a mile away, and they have no use for people who think they can fix everything with good intentions and deep pockets." The words stung because they hit so close to home, but Brett didn't flinch. "I understand. Do you? Because some of these children are going to die. Some of them are in pain every single day. Some of them have been abandoned by parents who couldn't handle having a sick child, and some of them are going to break your heart just by existing." Brett thought about Willard's matter-of-fact explanation of his dinosaur hospital, about the bald girl who'd waved at him from her doorway, about Elka reading stories with a voice that could make even dragons seem less frightening. "I'll contact. We can expedite your clearance to 2 weeks. You'll still need background checks and basic child safety certification." 2 weeks? Brett's heart sank. 2 weeks felt like a lifetime when he'd already lost 6 years. "Mr. Anthony," Janet said gently, "if you're serious about this, if you really want to help these children, then you'll understand that we have protocols for their protection. They've been through enough." Brett nodded, accepting the stack of paperwork Janet handed him, knowing she was right but feeling the weight of lost time pressing against his chest like a physical ache. He'd already restructured his responsibilities at Meridian, promoting his VP of operations and delegating day-to-day management so he could focus on what suddenly mattered most. He was halfway to the elevator when he heard the commotion. A child's screams echoed from the direction of the treatment rooms, the kind of heartbroken sobbing that spoke of pain and terror in equal measure. Brett found himself moving toward the sound without conscious thought, following the desperate cries to a room where medical staff were trying to calm a boy of maybe 7 who was fighting them with the strength of absolute panic. "No needles," the boy sobbed. "Please, no more needles. I want to go home." Brett could see Elka through the doorway, her face a mask of professional compassion, as she tried to soothe the terrified child. But even she seemed to be struggling with this one. The boy was beyond rational comfort, lost in the kind of fear that could only be understood by someone who'd lived it. Without thinking, Brett stepped into the room. "Hey there," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "That's a pretty impressive roar you've got there. Are you practicing to be a dragon?" The boy's sobs quieted slightly, confusion replacing pure terror. Brett could feel the surprised stares of the medical staff, could sense Elka's shock at his sudden appearance, but he kept his focus on the frightened child. "Sir, you can't be in here," a nurse began. "It's okay," Elka said quickly, recognizing that Brett had somehow connected with Tyler in a way none of them had managed. "Just stay back and let him try." "I'm designing a hospital for dragons," Brett continued, slowly moving closer. "But I can't figure out how to make it so the dragons don't get scared of the doctors. Maybe you could help me." The boy hiccuped, his tears still flowing, but his attention caught. "Dragons aren't scared of anything." "That's what I thought too," Brett said, settling into a chair beside the bed. "But then I started thinking about it, and even dragons must get scared sometimes. I mean, what if a dragon had to get a shot to make him better? Even if he knew it would help him breathe fire properly again, the needle might still be scary, right?" The boy nodded slowly, apparently intrigued by this line of reasoning. "So maybe," Brett continued, "the Dragon Hospital needs special brave-making rooms, places where dragons can practice being brave before they have to do scary things." "How do you practice being brave?" the boy asked. Brett glanced around the room, taking in the concerned faces of the medical team, the way Elka was watching him with something that might have been amazement. "Well," he said, "my friend Willard told me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. So maybe dragons practice by doing small brave things first and then bigger brave things, until they're ready for the really big brave things." The boy was quiet for a moment, considering this. What if the dragon had someone to hold his hand? Even brave dragons might want someone to hold their hand. "I think," Brett said seriously, "that's the smartest idea any dragon architect has ever had." 20 minutes later, the boy had received his injection with only a few quiet tears, his hand firmly clasped in Brett's, talking about whether dragon hospitals should have flying landing pads or swimming pools for water dragons. As the medical team finished up and prepared to move the boy back to his room, Elka approached Brett with an expression he couldn't read. "That was—" she began, then stopped, shaking her head. "I've never seen Tyler respond to anyone like that. He's been here for 3 weeks, and this is the first treatment he's accepted without sedation. Kids just need to know someone understands," Brett said, aware that they were having their first real conversation in 6 years and trying not to read too much into her willingness to talk to him. "How did you know about Willard?" she asked quietly. Brett felt his heart stop. "What? You mentioned him, about being brave even when you're scared." Elka's eyes searched his face. "Willard told me he talked to someone in the cafeteria, someone who listened to him talk about his dinosaur drawings." The moment stretched between them, loaded with 6 years of secrets and the weight of truth hanging in the balance. Brett could lie, could pretend it was coincidence, could protect them both from the conversation they weren't ready to have. Instead, he chose honesty. "He's an extraordinary kid," Brett said. "Smart, creative, kind. You've done an amazing job raising him." Elka's eyes filled with tears. She refused to let fall. "Brett! Miss Elka!" Willard's voice interrupted them, bright and excited as he rounded the corner. "I finished the swimming pool section for the water dinosaurs. Want to see?" He skidded to a stop when he saw Brett, his face lighting up with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. "Hey, you came back. I told you Mama tells the best stories." Brett looked at his son, then at Elka, and saw his entire future balanced on the edge of this moment. He could walk away, protect them all from the complications his presence would bring. He could go back to his empire and his empty victories and let them continue their life as a team of 2. Or he could stay and fight for the chance to become the man they deserved. Not the successful CEO who'd chosen wrong 6 years ago, but the father and partner who might still have time to choose right. "Yeah," Brett said, meeting Willard's eager gaze while feeling Elka's careful attention. "I came back. and I'd love to see what you've been working on." As Willard grabbed his hand and began pulling him toward the family room, chattering excitedly about underwater breathing apparatus for aquatic dinosaurs, Brett caught Elka's eye one more time. In her expression, he saw fear and hope warring with each other, saw the protective mother and the woman who'd once loved him completely fighting for control. But most importantly, he saw the door to possibility cracking open, just wide enough for someone determined to prove they'd change to squeeze through. It would have to be enough to start with. Chapter 6. Playing with Fire. The confrontation had been building for 2 weeks, like a storm gathering strength, and when it finally broke, it shattered the careful politeness they'd maintained in front of Willard and the hospital staff. Elka found Brett in room 318, an empty patient room that smelled of disinfectant and unspoken truths. She closed the door behind her with the quiet click of finality, her face a mask of controlled fury that Brett recognized from their worst arguments 6 years ago. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Her voice was low but vibrating with an anger that made the air itself feel dangerous. Brett looked up from the volunteer schedule he'd been studying. His clearance had come through that morning, making his presence official after 2 weeks of background checks and rapid training. He took in the rigid line of her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, the fire in her dark eyes that could still make his pulse race, even when it was directed at him with lethal intent. "I'm volunteering," he said carefully, "just like I told Janet I wanted to. Don't." Elka stepped closer, and Brett caught the familiar scent of jasmine perfume mixed with the antiseptic smell of the hospital. "Don't you dare stand there and pretend this is about charity. You've been here every day for 2 weeks, Brett. Every single day. You think I haven't noticed you, accidentally, showing up wherever Willard happens to be? He's a great kid. He's my kid." The words exploded out of her like a dam bursting, years of protective fury pouring into the sterile room. "Mine. I carried him for 9 months while you were off building your empire. I raised him through sleepless nights and ear infections and first steps that you missed because you were too important to stick around for a conversation about our future." Brett felt each word like a physical blow, but he forced himself to meet her eyes. "Elka, if you'd just let me explain." "Explain what?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter pain. "Explain how you filed for divorce while I was pregnant with your child. Explain how you never once tried to contact me to see if I was okay. Explain how you built a billion-dollar company while your son was learning to walk without a father." "I didn't know." The words tore out of Brett's throat like a confession ripped from his soul. "I swear to God, Elka, I didn't know you were pregnant. If I had known, you would have what?" She moved even closer, close enough that he could see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "You would have given up your precious merger. You would have chosen your family over your ambition. Because we both know how that conversation ended the last time." The accusation hit its mark because they both knew it was true. Brett remembered their final fight with crystal clarity. Her tears, his laptop, his absolute certainty that success required sacrifice, and his devastating choice of which sacrifice to make. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything. About what mattered. About what success really meant. About choosing work over the woman I loved more than my own life." "Loved?" Elka's voice cracked on the word. "You had a funny way of showing it. Do you know what it was like, Brett? Do you have any idea what it was like to be pregnant and alone, watching the news to see if my ex-husband was dating someone new while I was throwing up every morning and working double shifts to pay for prenatal care?" Brett closed his eyes, the image she painted hitting him like a physical assault. "Elka." "I waited for you to call," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than her shouting. "For months I waited. Even after the divorce was final, even after Willard was born and I was so tired I could barely function, Part of me kept hoping you'd somehow know, somehow come back. Why didn't you tell me? Brett asked desperately. Why didn't you call me when you found out you were pregnant? Elka stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was filled with a sadness that cut deeper than her anger. Because you'd already shown me what I was worth to you. You'd already made it clear that your company was more important than our marriage, more important than any future we might have had together. What was I supposed to do? Call you up and say, "Hey, Brett, I know you don't want a life with me, but how about a child?" I would have. You would have what? Married me out of obligation, resented me for trapping you, spent the rest of our lives making me feel like I'd ruined your dreams. Elka shook her head, tears finally spilling over. I loved you too much to do that to either of us. The words hung between them like a bridge made of broken glass, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to cross without bleeding. So you made the decision for both of us, Brett said quietly. I made the decision to protect my child from a father who might see him as an obligation instead of a gift. Elka wiped her tears with the back of her hand, but they kept coming. I made the decision to raise him, knowing he was wanted and loved, even if it meant doing it alone. Brett felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut since the day he'd signed those divorce papers. He was never an obligation, Elka. He could never be an obligation. God, he's perfect. He's everything I didn't know I wanted until I saw him building dinosaur hospitals and eating sandwiches like little symphonies. Don't. Elka's voice was raw now, all pretense of control abandoned. Don't you dare come in here after 6 years and fall in love with him now. Don't you dare disrupt the life we've built because you suddenly discovered you have a conscience. I'm not trying to disrupt anything. Then what are you trying to do? She stepped close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, could count the tears on her lashes. Because if you think you can just waltz back into our lives because you're lonely or guilty or whatever this is, you're wrong. Willard doesn't need a part-time father who'll disappear the minute business gets interesting again. I'm not going anywhere, Brett said fiercely. I'm not the same man who chose wrong 6 years ago. I'm not the man who was too blind to see that you and our family were the only success that ever mattered. Prove it. The challenge fell between them like a gauntlet thrown down in an ancient duel. Don't tell me you've changed, Brett. Show me. Show Willard. Show us both that this isn't just another one of your acquisitions, another problem you can solve with determination and good intentions. They stared at each other across 3 feet of hospital air, thick with 6 years of pain and regret and love that had never really died, just gone underground like a river flowing through stone. I will, Brett said finally. However long it takes, whatever I have to do, I'll prove to you that I've learned the difference between success and significance. I'll prove that I can be the father Willard deserves and the man you deserved all along. Elka studied his face for a long moment, searching for cracks in his resolve, looking for the ambitious, selfish boy who'd broken her heart. But something in his expression must have convinced her that the man standing before her was different, because when she spoke again, her voice carried a warning instead of a dismissal. He's going to love you, she said softly. Willard is going to love you because that's who he is, open and trusting and willing to believe the best about people. And when you break his heart the way you broke mine, I will make sure you never get the chance to do it again. The threat was delivered with the quiet certainty of a mother protecting her young, and Brett felt the full weight of what he was asking for, not just forgiveness, but trust. Not just a second chance, but the right to potentially hurt the 2 people who mattered most to him in the world. I won't break his heart, Brett said. I won't break yours. Not again. Elka reached for the door handle, then paused, looking back at him with eyes that held 6 years of questions and accusations and something that might have been the faintest glimmer of hope. "You broke mine once already, Brett. I survived it, learned to live without you, built a life that works. But Willard," she paused, her hand tightening on the door handle, "if you hurt my son, if you make him believe in a father who disappears when life gets complicated, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you understand exactly what I lost when you walked away." She left him standing alone in that empty hospital room, surrounded by the echoes of their confrontation and the weight of promises he wasn't sure he knew how to keep. But for the first time in 6 years, Brett Anthony felt like he was fighting for something that mattered more than profit margins or market share. He was fighting for the chance to be the man his son thought he could be, the father Willard deserved, and maybe, if he proved himself worthy, the partner Elka had once believed he could become. The question was whether love could really conquer the damage that pride and ambition had left in their wake. Only time would tell, and time was the one thing Brett couldn't acquire, couldn't rush, couldn't control. He could only earn it one day at a time, one choice at a time, one chance to choose right instead of wrong. Chapter 7. The Storm Breaks. Brett's world had been built on control, but grief, it turned out, was an anarchist. It hit him in waves over the next 3 days, in the elevator when he heard a child laugh, in his empty office when he found himself Googling child development milestones, in the middle of board meetings when he'd catch himself calculating how many bedtime stories he'd missed, how many scraped knees had gone uncomforted, how many proud moments had passed unwitnessed. 5 years and 3 months. That's how much of Willard's life had happened without him. First breath, first smile, first solid food, first steps that Elka had probably recorded on her phone, watching alone in their apartment, with no one to share the miracle of their son's achievement. First words that Brett would never hear, first day of preschool that had come and gone without a father's proud kiss. Goodbye. Birthdays. 5 birthdays with candles and wishes, and a little boy who'd probably asked his mother why other kids had daddies, and he didn't. The realization brought Brett to his knees in his private bathroom at Meridian Industries, dry heaving over the Italian marble toilet, while his secretary knocked discreetly on the door, asking if the Henderson Industries meeting could be moved because Mr. Anthony seemed to be feeling unwell, as if grief was something that could be cured with antacids and a good night's sleep. By Thursday, Brett couldn't stand his own company anymore. He found himself back at the hospital, not for his scheduled volunteer hours, but because it was the only place where the air didn't feel thin with regret. He'd completed the background checks and training with a speed that had impressed even Janet Morrison, throwing himself into learning about child development, medical trauma, and therapeutic play with the same intensity he'd once reserved for hostile takeovers. He found Willard in the art therapy room, surrounded by construction paper and safety scissors, working on what appeared to be an architectural masterpiece involving at least 14 different colors and enough glue to hold a building together. "Hey there, Dragon Architect," Brett said, settling into one of the child-sized chairs that made him feel like a giant in a dollhouse. Willard looked up with that smile that could stop traffic. Elka's warmth combined with something that Brett was beginning to recognize as his own stubborn optimism. "Brett, look what I'm making." Willard held up his creation, which appeared to be a cross between a spaceship and a castle, complete with landing pads and what looked like a moat filled with glitter. "It's a flying hospital for dragons who live on clouds." "That's incredible," Brett said, and meant it. "How do the ground dragons visit their flying friends?" "Oh, that's easy." Willard began pulling out another piece of paper covered in detailed sketches. "See, there are these special elevators that go straight up through the clouds, and they're big enough for even the biggest dragons, and they play music so the dragons don't get scared of heights." Brett watched his son explain the intricate engineering of interdimensional dragon transportation with the kind of passionate detail that most adults reserved for their life's work, and felt something profound shift in his understanding of what mattered in the world. "Willard," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Sure. Do you ever wonder about your dad?" Willard's hands stilled on his artwork, and for a moment, Brett worried he'd overstepped, pushed too hard into territory that wasn't his to explore. But then Willard nodded, his expression growing thoughtful. "Sometimes," he said quietly. "Mama says he wasn't ready to be a daddy when I was born, but that doesn't mean there was anything wrong with me." Brett's throat felt tight. "Your mama is very wise. She says maybe someday he'll be ready, and maybe someday he won't. But that my job is just to be the best Willard I can be, and that's enough." Each word was like a small miracle of grace, proof of the incredible mother Elka had become, proof of the strength she'd found to protect their son from the pain of abandonment, while keeping her own heart open to hope. "What do you think about that?" Brett asked. Willard considered this with the gravity of someone much older. "I think it would be nice to have a daddy, like, to teach me how to tie my shoes really fast, or to help me build bigger inventions, or to come to school on Dad Day instead of just me and Mama." Brett's vision blurred. "What else? And maybe someone who could reach the high shelves so Mama doesn't have to stand on chairs all the time. She tries to be tall, but she's really not very good at it." Willard giggled at this, then grew serious again. "But mostly I think it would be nice to have someone who loves Mama as much as I do. She gets lonely sometimes, even though she tries to hide it." The innocence of it, the pure-hearted wish for his mother's happiness above his own needs, nearly broke Brett completely. Here was this extraordinary little boy, wise beyond his years, more concerned with his mother's loneliness than his own lack of a father. "Willard," Brett said, his voice rough with emotion, "if your dad showed up tomorrow, what would you want to tell him?" Willard tilted his head, considering this hypothetical scenario with the same seriousness he applied to Dragon Hospital architecture. "I'd want to know if he likes to build things," he said finally, "and if he thinks my inventions are good ideas, and if he would help me take care of Mama, because that's a big job for just one kid." Brett nodded, not trusting his voice. "And I'd want to know if he's sorry," Willard continued. "Not just saying sorry, but really sorry, because Mama taught me that really sorry means you understand why someone got hurt, and you promise to try not to do it again." "That's very smart," Brett managed. "And then I'd probably hug him," Willard said matter-of-factly, "because even if he made mistakes, everyone deserves hugs when they're trying to be better." Brett couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. This perfect, beautiful, wise little boy, his son, was offering forgiveness to a hypothetical father with the kind of grace that most adults spent lifetimes trying to learn. "Willard," Brett said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "what if I told you that your dad is here? What if I told you that he's been looking for ways to become the kind of man who deserves to know you?" Willard's eyes went wide, the construction paper forgotten in his small hands. "Really?" Brett nodded, tears streaming down his face without shame or embarrassment. "Really? And he's so sorry, Willard. He's sorry he missed your first steps and your first words and every birthday candle you've ever blown out. He's sorry he wasn't there to help your mama when she was tired, sorry he wasn't there to reach the high shelves and teach you to tie your shoes. Is he—" Willard's voice was small, uncertain. "Is he you?" "Yeah, buddy," Brett said, opening his arms as his son launched himself into them with the uncomplicated trust of childhood. "It's me. I'm your dad, and I love you more than all the dragons in all the hospitals in all the clouds." Willard clung to him with small, fierce arms, and Brett held on like he was anchoring himself to everything that mattered in the world. Through his tears he felt something small being pressed into his hand. Willard's favorite toy dinosaur, a battered little triceratops that had clearly seen many adventures. "This is Buddy," Willard whispered against Brett's shoulder. "He helps when I'm sad or scared. You can borrow him until you don't feel lonely anymore." Brett clutched the small plastic dinosaur and his son, overwhelmed by the magnitude of love he'd stumbled into, terrified by the responsibility of living up to the faith this extraordinary child was placing in him. "I love you, Willard," he whispered into his son's curly hair. "I love you, and I'm never going to leave you again." "I love you too, Daddy," Willard whispered back, and those 4 words rewrote Brett's understanding of every success he'd ever achieved. They sat there in the art therapy room, surrounded by construction paper dreams and impossible inventions, father and son finding each other across the wreckage of lost time. And for the first time in 6 years, Brett Anthony felt like he was exactly where he belonged, not in a boardroom or a corner office, but in the arms of the child who'd just taught him that love wasn't something you earned through achievement. It was something you received through grace and gave back through presence, one day at a time, one hug at a time, one promise kept at a time. The storm had broken, and in its wake something beautiful was finally beginning to grow. Chapter 8. Legal Lines and Broken Hearts. The law office of Patterson, Mills and Associates smelled like leather-bound books and expensive decisions, but for the first time in his career, Brett Anthony was about to make a choice that would cost him everything he'd been trained to want. "You're making a mistake," his attorney, David Patterson, said for the 3rd time in 20 minutes, gesturing at the paternity test results and custody documents spread across his mahogany desk like evidence in a trial that would never happen. "The DNA test confirms what you suspected. Willard is definitively your biological son. You have every legal right to pursue joint custody, possibly even primary custody given your financial resources." "No." Brett's voice cut through Patterson's legal strategizing like a blade through silk. Outside the 40-story window, San Francisco buzzed with its usual ambitious energy, but Brett felt disconnected from the city that had once felt like his kingdom, focused instead on the small plastic dinosaur in his pocket. Buddy, his son's offering of comfort to a father who was finally learning what protection really meant. "The paternity test was unnecessary," Brett continued. "I know he's mine. The timing, the resemblance, everything Elka said. I don't need a lab to confirm what my heart already knows. But you insisted on legal certainty." He gestured at the court-authorized test results that had been obtained through proper channels after Elka had reluctantly agreed, understanding Brett needed legal clarity for the trust fund establishment. "No." Patterson's eyebrows shot up toward his perfectly styled hairline. "Brett, we're talking about your parental rights. The mother kept your child from you for 5 years without informing you of his existence. That's parental alienation, and in California—" "She didn't keep him from me," Brett interrupted, his voice steady with a certainty that had taken him 34 years to find. "I kept myself from him. I chose work over my marriage, chose ambition over love, chose success over the woman who was carrying my child. Elka protected our son from a father who wasn't ready to be one." Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Brett with the expression of a man watching his client voluntarily burn money. "Are you ready now?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a test that would determine not just legal strategy, but the kind of man Brett was going to choose to be for the rest of his life. "I'm trying to be," Brett said honestly, "and part of being ready means respecting the life Elka has built for our son, respecting the trust I need to earn back, respecting their right to decide if I belong in their family, not demanding a place in it because biology and lawyers say I can." "Brett," Patterson's voice took on the patient tone of someone explaining basic economics to a child. "Legal rights exist for a reason. The boy deserves financial support, proper medical care, educational opportunities." "Which he'll have," Brett said, pulling a manila envelope from his briefcase. I've established a trust fund for Willard's education and medical needs. Full funding through graduate school, medical coverage that supplements whatever Elka's insurance doesn't cover, and a college fund that will give him choices she and I never had. Patterson examined the trust documents with the expression of a man discovering his client had just given away a small fortune to someone who couldn't legally demand it. And custody? Elka has full custody. I want no legal claim to her decisions about our son unless she chooses to include me in them. I want no court-mandated visitation that makes Willard feel like a chess piece in someone else's game. I want no legal leverage that could be used to pressure either of them into accepting my presence in their lives. You're giving up millions of dollars worth of leverage. I'm giving up the illusion that love can be legislated, Brett corrected. My son doesn't need a father who won a court case. He needs a father who earned the right to be in his life. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, probably calculating the billable hours Brett was throwing away by choosing grace over legal warfare. And if she decides you don't belong in their lives, if she takes the money and disappears? Brett thought about Willard's small arms around his neck, about the whispered, "I love you too, Daddy," that had rewritten his understanding of wealth. He thought about Elka's fierce protection of their son, her strength in raising him alone, her right to decide who deserved access to the family she'd built from determination and love. Then I'll respect that decision and spend the rest of my life trying to become the man they might have wanted in their lives. 2 hours later, Brett stood outside General Memorial Hospital, holding a bag of children's books and fighting the urge to check his phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes. The trust documents were filed, the legal claims officially waived, and now he had to trust that love would be enough to bridge the gap that law could have forced closed. He found Elka in the pediatric supply room, counting inventory with the methodical precision of someone whose mind was clearly elsewhere. She looked up when he knocked, and he watched her expression cycle through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope before settling into careful neutrality. "Willard's with the art therapist," she said without preamble, "if you're looking for him." "Actually," Brett said, stepping into the small room and closing the door behind him, "I was looking for you." Elka set down her clipboard, her posture shifting into the defensive stance he'd learned to recognize as her preparing for bad news. "If this is about custody arrangements or legal, I've waived all legal claims to Willard." The words hit her like a physical blow, and Brett watched her face go white as she gripped the edge of the supply shelf for support. "You what?" "I've established a trust fund for his education and medical needs, but I've waived any legal claim to custody or visitation. You have full legal authority over all decisions regarding our son." Elka stared at him like he'd just announced his intention to give away gravity. "Why?" "Because you've been his mother for 5 years without any help from me. Because you've made every hard decision, sacrificed everything to give him a good life, earned the right to decide who belongs in his world. Because love isn't something that can be mandated by a judge or legislated by lawyers." "Brett," Elka's voice was barely above a whisper, "do you have any idea what you've just done? You're a billionaire. You could have hired the best attorneys in the country, could have argued parental alienation, could have traumatized our son by turning his family into a battlefield," Brett finished. "Could have forced you to accept my presence out of legal obligation instead of choice. Could have taught Willard that love is something you take instead of something you earn." Elka's eyes filled with tears she was fighting to control. "You could have won. I could have lost everything that mattered by winning everything that didn't." They stood in that small supply room surrounded by bandages and antiseptic, the sterile supplies of healing, while something indefinable but precious began to heal between them. "The trust fund," Elka began. has no strings attached. It's Willard's, regardless of whether you ever want to see me again. His education, his medical care, his future. That's not contingent on anything I want or need from either of you. Why? She asked again, and this time the question carried 6 years of pain and disbelief. Because 5 years ago I had a choice between my family and my ambition, and I chose wrong. Today I had a choice between what I wanted and what you and Willard needed, and I chose right. Maybe for the first time in my adult life. Before Elka could respond, the supply room door burst open and Janet Morrison appeared, her face white with the kind of fear that hospital staff learned to mask but never quite managed to hide. Elka, we need you in the ER. Now. What's wrong? Elka was already moving, her maternal instincts triggered by the urgency in Janet's voice. It's Willard. He collapsed during art therapy. High fever, difficulty breathing. The paramedics are bringing him up from the children's ward now. Brett felt the world tilt sideways, felt every molecule of air leave the hospital as the words registered. Willard, his beautiful, brilliant son who'd given him a plastic dinosaur for comfort, was being rushed to the emergency room. Elka was already running toward the elevator, and Brett followed, his heart hammering against his ribs as they rode down in silence thick with parental terror. In the ER, they found controlled chaos. Doctors, nurses, machines all focused on a small form on a gurney that looked impossibly fragile under the harsh fluorescent lights. Pneumonia, Dr. Patel explained quickly to Elka while Brett hung back, unsure of his place in this medical emergency. Severe respiratory distress. We need to get him stabilized and on oxygen immediately. Brett watched his son, pale, unconscious, fighting for breath, and felt every successful moment of his adult life revealed as meaningless noise in the face of this one small boy's struggle to breathe. "Can I?" he started to ask, then stopped, remembering that he just legally established himself as having no right to be here, no claim to the decisions being made about Willard's care. Elka looked at him across the chaos of medical intervention, and for a moment, 6 years of careful distance collapsed. "Yes," she said simply, "you can stay. He's your son too." And so Brett Anthony, billionaire CEO who'd just given away his legal rights to fatherhood, stood beside the woman he'd never stopped loving and watched medical professionals fight to save the child who'd just taught him the difference between success and significance, between taking what you wanted and earning what you needed. Some battles, he realized, were too important to be won through force. Some victories could only be achieved through surrender. Chapter 9. When Walls Come Down. Time moved differently in the pediatric ICU, measured not in hours but in heartbeats, not in minutes but in the rhythm of ventilators and the soft beeping of monitors that tracked the fragile thread connecting their son to life. Brett had been sitting beside Willard's bed for 18 hours, holding a small hand that felt impossibly delicate in his own, while machines breathed for the child who'd just taught him how to love unconditionally. The pneumonia had struck hard and fast. One moment, Willard had been explaining the aerodynamics of cloud dragons. The next, he was fighting for every breath. "The antibiotics are working, Doctor," Patel had assured them during her morning rounds. "His oxygen levels are improving, but pneumonia in children can be unpredictable. The next 24 hours are critical." Elka sat in the chair opposite Brett, her scrubs wrinkled from sleeping in them, her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and tears she'd only allowed herself to shed when she thought Brett wasn't looking. They'd barely spoken since the crisis began, both focused entirely on the small figure between them, who represented their entire world. "You should go home," Brett said quietly, his voice hoarse from hours of reading aloud to their unconscious son. "Get some sleep, take a shower. I'll stay with him." Elka looked up from the medical chart she'd been studying. Even off duty, She couldn't stop being a nurse, couldn't stop trying to understand every detail of Willard's treatment. "I'm not leaving him." "Elka, you haven't slept in almost 2 days. You're not helping him by making yourself sick." "I said I'm not leaving him." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, loud enough to disturb the medical hush of the ICU. She immediately looked around apologetically, then back at Brett with eyes that held all the protective ferocity of a mother defending her young. Brett understood. In the face of their child's mortality, everything else, their history, their pain, their carefully constructed boundaries, had become irrelevant. There was only Willard fighting for his life while they fought against the helplessness of watching. "Then let me go get you some coffee," Brett offered, "and maybe some food that isn't from a vending machine." Elka was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "The cafeteria coffee is terrible, but there's a little place called Rosie's about 3 blocks away. Willard and I go there sometimes when I have long shifts. They know how I like my coffee." The information was offered like a small gift, a glimpse into the life she and Willard had built together, the routines and rituals that had sustained them through 5 years of being a family of 2. "How do you like your coffee?" Brett asked. "2 sugars, extra cream, and—" She hesitated, then smiled for the first time since Willard had collapsed. "They make these terrible blueberry muffins that Willard loves. He calls them skyberry cakes because the blueberries look like little blue clouds." Brett felt his throat tighten at the image of his son inventing poetic names for bakery items, of Elka indulging his imagination while building a life full of small joys despite his absence. One skyberry cake coming up. When Brett returned an hour later, he found Elka reading to Willard from a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are, her voice soft and musical as she brought Morris Sendak's monsters to life for their sleeping child. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all, she read, her voice catching slightly on the words. Brett set her coffee and muffin on the bedside table and settled back into his chair, listening as she continued the story. When she finished, she closed the book and looked at Brett with eyes that seemed to see him clearly for the first time since he'd walked back into their lives. "He asked me about you, you know," she said quietly. "When he was 3, he started noticing that other kids had daddies. He wanted to know where his daddy was, if his daddy loved him. If maybe his daddy was just lost and trying to find his way back home." Brett felt each word like a small knife to the heart, but he didn't interrupt, sensing that this was something Elka needed to say, a story she'd been carrying alone for too long. "I told him that his daddy lived far away, that he had important work to do, but that didn't mean there was anything wrong with Willard. I told him that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but that children are never mistakes." "Elka, let me finish." She reached out and adjusted Willard's blanket with the automatic care of a mother who'd spent countless nights making sure her child was comfortable. "When he was 4, he asked if maybe his daddy didn't want him, and I realized that I had to choose between protecting Willard from the truth or protecting you from his questions." Brett waited, knowing that this moment balanced on the edge of everything, forgiveness or condemnation, understanding or permanent exile from the family he'd lost through his own choices. "I chose Willard," Elka said simply. "I told him that his daddy wasn't ready to be a daddy when Willard was born, but that didn't mean his daddy didn't love him. I told him that love sometimes means waiting for someone to become the person they need to be. The grace of it, the way she'd protected both their son and Brett himself from the harsh edges of abandonment, left Brett speechless. Even in her pain, even in her anger, she'd chosen to preserve Willard's capacity for love over her right to blame. "Why?" Brett managed. "Because angry children grow up to be angry adults, and I wanted Willard to grow up believing in the possibility of love, even if it meant protecting the man who'd broken my heart. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the mechanical rhythm of Willard's breathing and the distant hum of hospital life continuing around their small island of vigil. "I was so angry when you showed up at the hospital," Elka continued. "Angry and terrified, because I'd spent 5 years building a life that worked, a family that was complete, and suddenly there you were, threatening to change everything." "I never meant to threaten anything." "I know." She met his eyes across their son's sleeping form. "That's what scared me most. You weren't some deadbeat trying to avoid responsibility or some narcissist demanding rights you hadn't earned. You were just you. Changed, maybe, but still the man I'd fallen in love with before I learned to be afraid of losing you." Brett felt something shift in the air between them, some wall that had stood for 6 years beginning to crumble under the weight of shared fear and love for their child. "Elka, I need you to know." "Mama?" Willard's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through their conversation like a bell announcing the arrival of Grace. Both parents immediately focused on their son, whose eyes were open and alert for the first time in 24 hours. "Hey, sweetheart," Elka said, reaching for Willard's hand while trying to keep the relief out of her voice. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," Willard said, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube they'd removed that morning. "And my chest hurts. But I heard you talking." His eyes found Brett's face. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, Buddy," Brett said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave us quite a scare." "I was dreaming about the cloud dragons," Willard said seriously. "They were having trouble breathing too, so I taught them how to use the special machines to help their lungs work better." Even sick, even exhausted, their son was turning his medical crisis into an engineering problem for imaginary creatures. Brett felt a surge of pride so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. "That's very thoughtful of you," Elka said, smoothing Willard's hair with gentle fingers. "I'm sure the cloud dragons appreciated the help." "Daddy," Willard said, turning back to Brett with serious dark eyes. "Were you really here the whole time?" "Every minute," Brett promised. "I read you 7 books, told you about 12 different kinds of dinosaurs, and sang you 4 lullabies that I probably remembered wrong." Willard smiled, an expression so bright it seemed to light up the entire ICU. "Will you stay until I'm all better?" Brett looked at Elka, asking permission without words, watching as she made a decision that would determine whether he remained on the outside of their family or found his way back into the center of it. "Yes," she said quietly, her eyes never leaving Brett's face. "He'll stay until you're all better." "Promise?" Willard asked, looking between his parents with the absolute trust of a child who believed that promises made in hospital rooms were sacred contracts. "Promise," Brett and Elka said simultaneously, and something in the way their voices harmonized around that single word suggested they were making a vow that extended far beyond Willard's recovery. As their son drifted back to sleep, secure in the knowledge that both his parents would be there when he woke up, Brett and Elka sat in the darkness of the pediatric ICU and began the careful work of building trust from the ashes of old pain. Some walls, Brett realized, weren't torn down by force, but by the patient erosion of shared love, one moment of grace at a time, one promise kept at a time, one choice to choose each other over the safety of staying apart. And sometimes, love got a second chance not because it deserved one, but because children taught adults that the heart had a greater capacity for forgiveness than anyone dared to hope. Chapter 10. Love's Second Dawn. Recovery tasted like chocolate chip pancakes and sounded like Willard's laughter echoing through Brett's kitchen on a Saturday morning, 6 weeks after pneumonia had nearly stolen him away. "Higher, Daddy," Willard called from his perch on Brett's shoulders, reaching for the ceiling fan he was convinced needed dinosaur decorations. "The pterodactyls can't land if their landing strip isn't high enough." Brett obliged, lifting his son another few inches, while Elka watched from the breakfast bar, her coffee growing cold as she observed this domestic scene that felt both completely natural and utterly miraculous. She'd been staying at Brett's Nob Hill penthouse since Willard's discharge, and over the past month and a half, they'd carefully rebuilt their relationship, not as the young couple they'd been, but as the mature adults they'd become. "Be careful with him," Elka said, but her voice carried laughter instead of worry. "He just got his strength back." "I'm being very careful with our dragon architect," Brett said, gently lowering Willard to the couch and settling beside him. "In fact, I think someone who's been such a brave patient deserves a special adventure. What do you think about spending the weekend at a cabin by the lake?" Willard's eyes went wide with excitement. "A real cabin? With a real lake? Can we build boats and feed ducks and roast marshmallows?" "All of that and more," Brett promised, then looked at Elka with an expression that asked for permission while hoping for something deeper. "If your mama thinks it's a good idea." Elka felt her heart do something complicated in her chest as she met Brett's gaze. These past 3 weeks had been a careful dance of rediscovery, stolen conversations during Willard's naps, shared glances over bedtime stories, moments when their hands would brush reaching for the same coffee cup, and neither would pull away immediately. They'd been falling in love again in slow motion, learning each other as the people they'd become, rather than the people they'd been. "I think," Elka said carefully, "that sounds like exactly what we all need." The cabin was a 2-hour drive north of the city, nestled in the mountains surrounding Lake Tahoe, like a secret hidden in plain sight. Brett had bought it during his marriage to Elka, back when they'd dreamed of weekend getaways and quiet mornings in bed, and lazy afternoons building the kind of life that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. They'd never had the chance to use it together. "It's perfect," Willard announced as they pulled into the gravel driveway, taking in the log walls and wrap-around porch with the enthusiasm of someone discovering buried treasure. "It looks like where forest dragons would live if they wanted to vacation by the water." Brett carried their bags while Elka and Willard explored the property, and he couldn't help but smile as he watched his son point out optimal locations for dragon landing pads, while Elka examined the flower gardens that had grown wild in the years since Brett had last visited. "You've kept it exactly the same," Elka said when Brett joined them on the dock that extended into the crystal-clear water of the lake. "I couldn't bring myself to change anything," Brett admitted. "It felt like changing it would be admitting that what we'd planned here was never going to happen." Elka was quiet for a moment, watching Willard attempt to convince a family of ducks that his shoelaces would make excellent nesting material. "What did we plan here?" she asked softly. Brett felt his chest tighten with the memory of dreams they'd shared over takeout, Chinese food and architectural magazines, sketching additions to the cabin on napkins, and planning a future that had felt as solid as the mountains surrounding them. "Everything," he said. "We planned lazy Sunday mornings and Christmas by the fireplace, and maybe—" He paused, unsure if he had the right to voice those old dreams. "Maybe what?" "Maybe teaching our kids how to fish off this dock. Maybe building tree houses and hosting birthday parties and creating the kind of family memories that last forever." Elka's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "We can still do those things, you know. Not the same way we planned them, but maybe better. Maybe with more appreciation for how precious they are." That evening, they roasted marshmallows on the fire pit Brett had built into the back deck, Willard providing detailed commentary on the optimal marshmallow-to-chocolate ratio for s'mores, while the sun painted the lake in shades of gold and amber. "Mama," Willard said around a mouthful of graham cracker and melted chocolate, "do you think the water dragons are having their own campfire down at the bottom of the lake?" "I think they're probably jealous of our marshmallows," Elka said, wiping chocolate from his chin with the automatic care of motherhood. Water dragons probably have to settle for s'mores made with seaweed and fish. That sounds gross, Willard said matter-of-factly. Maybe we should invent underwater campfires for them. Daddy, do you think fire can burn underwater if you engineer it right? Brett listened to his son's impossible questions and his ex-wife's patient answers, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't even realized had been restless. This was what he'd been searching for in all those boardrooms and business deals, not the acquisition of wealth or power, but the creation of moments that mattered, the building of love that would last long after quarterly reports were forgotten. Later, after Willard had fallen asleep on the couch in front of the fireplace, surrounded by picture books and toy dinosaurs, Brett and Elka found themselves alone on the deck, sharing a bottle of wine and the kind of comfortable silence that had once been their specialty. "He's incredible," Brett said, watching their son sleep through the glass doors. "Smart and kind and imaginative and— God, Elka, you've done such an amazing job with him." "We've done an amazing job with him," Elka corrected gently. "These past few weeks, watching you with him, Brett, you're the father I always hoped you'd be. Patient and present and completely in love with everything about him." "I'm completely in love with everything about both of you," Brett said quietly, the words slipping out before he could second-guess them. Elka turned to look at him, her wineglass forgotten in her hands. "Brett, I know we're taking things slow. I know we're figuring out what this is, what we could be, whether it's possible to build something new from the pieces of what we had before." Brett set down his own glass and turned to face her fully. "But I need you to know that I love you. Not the memory of you, not the idea of you, but you. The woman who raised our son to believe in forgiveness, who protected his capacity for love even when I didn't deserve it, who turned herself into the kind of person who saves lives every day." Elka's breath caught, and Brett saw 6 years of careful self-protection warring with the hope she'd been afraid to acknowledge. "I love the nurse who reads stories to scared children, and the mother who makes blueberry muffins into sky-berry cakes, and the woman who chose grace over anger, even when anger would have been justified." Brett reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers the way they used to when the world felt too big, and they were all each other needed to make it manageable. "I love you too," Elka whispered, and the admission seemed to surprise her as much as it relieved him. "I never stopped loving you, even when I was furious with you, even when I thought I'd never see you again. I just learned to love you from a distance, to love the man I hoped you might become someday." They sat, holding hands on the deck of the cabin where they'd once planned their future, watching stars appear over the lake like promises being written across the sky, and Brett felt the last of his walls come down. "Elka," he said, his voice rough with emotion and hope, and 6 years of longing finally allowed to surface. "I want to try again, not to recreate what we had, but to build something better, something stronger, something worthy of the family we've become." Instead of answering with words, Elka leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, a question being asked and answered simultaneously. But then Brett's arms came around her and she melted into him, and suddenly they were 26 and 24 again, desperate for each other and certain that this love could survive anything the world threw at them. Except now they were 34 and 32, and they'd learned that love wasn't about certainty. It was about choosing each other every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. "Take me inside," Elka whispered against his lips, and Brett felt his heart stop and restart in the space between those 4 words. They moved quietly through the cabin, checking on Willard, who was sleeping deeply on the couch with his favorite dinosaur clutched in his small fist. Brett gently covered their son with a blanket, and Elka turned on the baby monitor they'd brought, because even in the middle of reclaiming their love story, they were parents first. Brett's bedroom overlooked the lake, moonlight streaming through the windows and painting everything in silver and shadow. They undressed each other slowly, rediscovering bodies that were familiar but changed, mapping the physical evidence of 6 years lived separately. A scar on Brett's shoulder from a skiing accident, stretch marks on Elka's hips from carrying their child. The way time had settled on both of them, like a gentle reminder that they were no longer children playing at forever. "You're even more beautiful," Brett whispered, his hands trembling as they traced the curve of her waist, the softness of her skin, the places where motherhood had changed her body into something sacred. "I was afraid you'd think I was different," Elka admitted, her own hands exploring the broader shoulders, the deeper lines around his eyes, the man he'd become in their years apart. "You are different," Brett said, lowering her onto the bed with a reverence that made her feel like a prayer being offered to someone he'd thought he'd lost forever. "You're stronger, more beautiful, more everything I never knew I needed." They made love like people who'd been given an impossible gift, slowly, deliberately, with the kind of gratitude that turned physical connection into spiritual communion. Every touch was a promise, every kiss a commitment, every moment of joining together a celebration of second chances and the grace that made them possible. Afterward, they lay entwined in the moonlight, Brett's fingers tracing lazy patterns on Elka's skin while she listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. "Marry me," Brett said suddenly, the words spoken into the darkness like a prayer he'd been holding back for 6 years. Elka lifted her head to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been joy. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, sitting up and pulling her with him so they were facing each other in the tangle of sheets and moonlight. "Not because we have a child together, not because it's the practical thing to do, but because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Because you make me a better man, a better father, a better human being. Because I want to spend every day for the rest of my life proving that I've learned the difference between success and significance." Elka was quiet for so long that Brett began to worry he'd pushed too hard, asked too much too soon. But then she smiled, the expression so radiant it seemed to light up the entire room. "Ask me again in the morning," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When Willard can hear you, when we can include him in this decision, when it's not just about us but about the family we're choosing to become." Brett nodded, understanding that she was right, that this decision belonged to all three of them, that their son deserved to be part of the moment when his parents chose to become a family, officially as well as emotionally. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Brett dreamed of Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime stories, and a future measured in love instead of profit margins. He woke to the sound of Willard's laughter and the smell of bacon cooking, and found Elka and their son in the kitchen, working together to prepare breakfast, while morning light streamed through the windows like a blessing. "Daddy," Willard called out when he spotted Brett in the doorway. "Mama's teaching me how to flip pancakes. Want to see?" Brett watched his son attempt to flip a pancake that was clearly too big for his small hands, watched Elka guide him patiently, watched them work together with the easy collaboration of a team that had been facing the world together for 5 years. And then, because he was a man who'd finally learned to recognize perfect moments when they appeared, Brett dropped to one knee in the middle of the cabin kitchen. "Willard," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to ask, "how would you feel about me marrying your mama?" Willard's eyes went wide, the spatula forgotten in his hands. "Really? You want to marry Mama and be a real family?" "The realest family," Brett promised, "with pancake breakfasts and bedtime stories and help reaching the high shelves. But only if you think it's a good idea." Willard looked between his parents with the serious consideration of someone making an important decision. "Will you help me build dragon hospitals for real?" he asked finally. "We'll build the most amazing dragon hospital the world has ever seen," Brett promised. "And will you take care of Mama when she's sad? Always." And will you teach me to tie my shoes the fast way? Brett laughed, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Every day until you can do it with your eyes closed. Willard nodded solemnly, then broke into a grin that rivaled the sunrise over the lake. Then yes, I think you should marry Mama. Brett turned to Elka, who was watching this exchange with tears streaming down her face and love shining in her eyes like starlight. Elka Harms, he said, his voice carrying 6 years of regret and hope and the promise of forever. Will you marry me again? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that the second time around I know what matters most? Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Brett Anthony, I'll marry you again. Willard whooped with joy and launched himself into their group hug, and Brett felt the last piece of his broken world click back into place. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the lake and the mountains in pristine white. And inside the cabin where they'd once dreamed of building a family, 3 people who'd found their way back to each other watched the world transform into something beautiful and new. Some love stories, Brett realized, weren't about getting it right the first time. Some love stories were about learning to choose love over fear, presence over ambition, and grace over the need to be right. Some love stories were about second chances and the courage to believe that broken things could be made whole again, that lost time could be redeemed by time well spent, and that the most extraordinary success in life was the simple act of loving well and being loved in return. As snow fell outside and laughter filled the cabin, Brett Anthony finally understood that he hadn't just won back his family. He discovered what it meant to be truly, impossibly, extraordinarily wealthy.